Hi friends, so I wanted to talk about this new concept that I've been toying around with, and it's called ROA or return on attention. And we often talk about return on investment or ROI in a bunch of different contexts, but especially when we're in the knowledge or the attention economy, I thought it's incredibly important to talk about ROA when really every app, notification, book, article, or podcast is just competing for our attention. So in this video, I'm going to go over 3 things that I think were extremely useful for us to understand the concept of ROA. First, what is it and why is it important? Second, how can we maximize ROA from a theoretical standpoint? And finally, the third thing, what are the few practical tips and tools that we can actually use to maximize and increase our ROA? So let's start with the first one. What is ROA and why is it important? Tristan Harris, who is popularly known as the conscience keeper of Silicon Valley, often talks about the attention economy and how people behind the screens are much more powerful than people in front of them, and why the attention economy has really started a race to the bottom of the brainstem. And it's really true when we look around us, because people today, including me and including most of the people who I know, are just spending more time in front of their screens than doing anything else. And at these times, especially when everything on your phone, your browser, or your laptop is really competing for your attention, the concept of ROA becomes extremely important from 2 perspectives, qualitative and quantitative. From a qualitative standpoint, it's extremely important for us to realize that attention is fixed, limited, and exponentially decreasing when you compare it with value. Which means that if you really spend 1 unit of attention on something, learning something or reading an article or just responding to an alert on your phone, if that thing wasn't intrinsically valuable, the next time when you respond to another thing, your attention is not 1 unit less. Rather, it is 5 or 6 units less, because it's not directly linked with the amount of value that a thing intrinsically generates for you. And from a quantitative perspective, ROA essentially means the number of units of value that you derive by spending 1 unit of your attention on any particular thing. So let's say you have 2 articles to choose from. One is the top 5 news items from CNN delivered right in your inbox, and the other is an article from The Atlantic on personal development. Now, really what's more valuable is a subjective issue, but from the point of view of preserving attention, oftentimes consuming content that is more long form and in-depth is more valuable than consuming content that is short form or is just a summary of the key things. And while that may be valuable in certain contexts, usually for preserving attention, or rather for increasing it, it's useful to go for deeper, longer, and more fleshed out articles. And I'm in no way saying that Atlantic is better than CNN, rather they both serve different purposes. The idea is that it's often easier to fall into the trap of consuming snippets of information and not consuming knowledge as a whole. And it's often harder to sit down and without any distractions read a 30-minute article. And doing the latter, is oftentimes more useful because it does not dissipate your attention in a bunch of different things, rather preserves your attention and builds on top of it, which is incredibly more useful in the long run. And the attention that you preserve then can be used in multiple different places, which require deep work, deep focus, and sustained periods of time without any distraction. On the other hand, if you were to regularly consume only short form content with a bunch of disruptions just always vying for your attention would deplete to such an extent that it would be extremely hard to get back to the original level of attention that you started with anytime in the near future. But really, the second point is, how can we maximize ROA to consume more knowledge and process it at a deeper level, rather than just processing it at a surface level and hopping on from one article, book, podcast to another. And I think there are a few ways to maximize ROA, but really in my view, it boils down to 2 key principles. First is to maximize soft links, not hard links, which means that whenever you're consuming or reading, say, an article, the natural tendency of the mind is to put that article in one box or multiple different boxes. So let's say if I'm reading this blog that I love reading, Wait But Why. If there's an article on Wait But Why about how to pick your profession, the mind tends to resort to tagging that article with a bunch of different things, which include personal development, self-improvement, career advice, professional development, and so on and so forth. And those are hard links. But I think in the long term, because knowledge cannot be categorized in a finite number of tags, those hard links actually become less useful in the long run, because the more information, knowledge you consume, the less useful those individual hard links become. And that brings me to the point of creating soft links, which is nothing but the idea of categorizing knowledge not based on categories itself, but rather based on the content. So let's say if you read an article, it's better to write down a sentence or two, and that's more than enough in the long term. So it's better to write down a sentence or two about what you really learned from that article and what was the one or two key points that you picked up from that, and store that as a soft link. Now, what that does in the long term is that you forget what kind of knowledge you consumed, let's say 5 years ago, but you remember the essence of the thing that you consume. And that is much more important in being able to take action, produce something of value, or just sharpening your thinking more, rather than just categorizing that article as a piece of information in a bunch of different tags and then forgetting about it and not being able to process it because, well, in the first place, those hard links are infinite. And the second principle that I think has really helped me maximize ROA is to set aside time for just thinking. And I've noticed that we have this tendency of trying to fit in more stuff, cram in more stuff, more reading time, more listening time, and just more internet time in our schedule because we think that the more we consume, the better we can get. However, I've started to realize of late that consuming more and more knowledge is probably not the best idea as consuming less of it, but equally processing it as well. So I think this internal shift of understanding that thinking time equals reading time is incredibly important as well. And finally, coming to the idea of some practical tips and tools we can use to maximize ROA, I think at a meta level, there are 3 categories for the stuff that you consume on the internet. The stuff that requires no processing, stuff that requires shallow processing, and the stuff that requires deep processing. And I think it's pretty self-explanatory, but the stuff that requires no processing is the stuff that you want to eliminate in the long term. You read an article, you don't like it, you don't like the website, you don't like the magazine, you know that articles or recommendations from this particular source are not valuable, so you want to minimize that as much as possible. The stuff that requires shallow processing is stuff that you just found cool and you can reference later. It's not stuff that you need to process at a deep level, it's not stuff that you need to think about more, and it's definitely not stuff that needs to go into your evergreen note-taking system, which is something that Andy Matuszczyk, who is a designer, researcher, and engineer, uses to consume information and produce more knowledge. And finally, the stuff that requires deep processing is the kind of knowledge that you want to set aside time to think about and stuff that you want to read about properly without any interruptions. And that is the stuff that you need to be focusing on most in order to maximize your ROA. And one tool that I'm sure that most of us would know about is Instapaper, which allows you to save articles and things that you catch on the internet to save for later reading. But again, the idea over there is not to maximize or optimize for the quantity of the information or knowledge, but rather the quality of it. And at the same time, you also have to be disciplined enough to actually finish the list of articles that piles up in your Instapaper, because you don't want that resource to also be just a dump of all the things that you consume on the internet. And the second practical tool that I think has really worked for me is developing this reading inbox. And I understand that all of us have subscribed to a ton of different email newsletters, RSS feeds, tweet storms, subscriptions, and a bunch of other things. But the idea is not to be overwhelmed by the amount of information that exists out there, but rather to specifically think about what resonates with you, what strikes a chord with you, and just cherry pick that and put that in your reading inbox. And that reading inbox could take literally any form. You could use Notion Web Clipper, Instapaper, or a bunch of different tools, but really the idea is to set aside things for your reading inbox, which is distinct from the rest of the internet, which includes everything from your newsletters to all the other websites that you see. And I think having this practical system is incredibly useful. So these are the few ways that I think maximizing ROA can work. I really hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know what you think about it, and please feel free to share any feedback. Thank you.